Okay, hello everybody. So nice to see you here, and thank you for choosing us, because the competition is The Future of Wealth with David Rubenstein next door, which looks like it's standing room only, or what's going to happen with the big, beautiful, sorry, I have to do it in scare quotes, the big, beautiful bill in the tent, so I'm sure there's other things going on. But we think in the long term, this is the most important conversation. I'm actually not kidding. So thank you for being here. My name is Vivian Schiller, and I'm the Vice President and Executive Director of Aspen Digital. We're a program of the Aspen Institute, a policy program, they're called, of the Aspen Institute. And our focus is on the intersection and the collision of technology, innovation, AI, information ecosystems, cybersecurity, all of which tend to sort of converge into a great big, beautiful bundle. So, we'll just leave it at that. So what we want to talk about today is, we want to talk about AI governance, which is, I meant it when I said, I think this is one of the most important conversations happening in the planet right now. I don't need to tell, all of you are here because you're well aware of how quickly AI capabilities are accelerating. And you also know that AI knows no borders. And is developing, honestly, with a speed and a scale that is unmatched in human history. So the fact is, global policies, even if everybody was on the same page, can't possibly keep up. Policy processes are just too slow and deliberate and thoughtful, which is a good thing, but the technology is not waiting around. But even aside from that, there's not even a consensus on what needs to be regulated, or even if it should be regulated at all, which I think some of our friends in some of the tech companies would advocate for. But yet the repercussions of those sets of decisions are absolutely crucial to all endeavors that we're following on Earth. So the good news is I have much smarter people on this panel about this than I am, and they're going to share their wisdom. Immediately to my left is Klon Kitchen, who is the Managing Director and Global Technology Practice Lead at Beacon Global Strategies, which is a national security advisory firm, and he's a non-resident senior fellow at AEI. Alexandra Reeve Givens is the CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a civil society nonprofit group doing absolutely extraordinary work fighting to protect civil liberties and civil rights in the digital age. And finally, Vilas Dhar, who is the president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. They are a philanthropy. They are really the biggest, most influential philanthropy, certainly in the country, if not in the world, advancing AI for good. He is himself an AI expert, and a member of the UN high-level advisory body on AI. So Vilas will have a lot of the sort of UN or transnational organization perspective. Okay, so let's dive in. The first thing I want to talk about is we just want to level set. So why do we need regulation? Or put another way, what exactly is the problem we're trying to solve? And Vilas, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Vivian, and thanks everyone for being here. Sunday morning, like the time to really dig into AI governance.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like we woke up, we had our Cheerios, and we're ready to go. Look, sometimes in the obvious is all the nuance, right? Well, why do we need to regulate AI? I mean, there are some pretty basic things that have almost become cliches, but for 25 years we've been talking about them. That AI systems operate in ways that have immense and meaningful influence on people's lives, we know that. But let's take one step up the creation value chain of AI. How is AI developed? There's no such thing as domestic AI. There's no such thing as geographic fencing around the data that trains these systems. There's very little in the way of regulatory environments that says some AI will be used here and not used somewhere else. So if we begin with the idea, and Vivian said it, it's borderless, let's talk about what that means, what it means for people. It means that AI systems that are developed in very specific places, often with very specific philosophical worldviews, with very specific technological criteria on what kind of data is selected, and maybe most importantly, the kinds of design choices that are made about them reflect often a very specific way of thinking about the world. And yet the products that are created then guide visibly and invisibly decisions that affect billions of people around the world. To even have to ask the question, why should we regulate it, I think is on face quite obvious, right? These systems will affect every person on the planet and will be done really at the whim of a very small set of the holders of technological power. So if we assume that AI is moving at the speed of computation, at Moore's law, whatever cliche you want to bring into this room, I think we have a very powerful question to ask, which is, where is the innovation in our social, our economic, our cultural, our political systems? And what speed does that move at? How do we begin to actually create a world that lionizes and champions the idea that we can change the systems in which we govern, not technology, but the ways it impacts the ways that we interact with each other in our systems of power, in the ways that we build markets, in the ways that we create human rights and dignity for every person on the planet.
Great, thank you. And you raised the issue about where do we go from here, and we're going to come back to that a little bit later in the conversation. Alex, I want to turn to you. So a lot of the power right now, almost all of the power, is with the private companies that are building the AI frontier models and are advancing the AI capabilities. So what's the problem with that? That was a slow pitch to you.
Yeah, well, let me pick up on some of the pieces that Vilas was putting down. We say that AI is going to transform aspects of people's lives. I think it's worth actually spending a moment on really thinking through what that means. Because AI is increasingly mediating the way in which we engage with the world and the ways in which we engage with each other. So I'll put out kind of 3 areas that my organization focuses on that I think we all need to be thinking about when we think of the societal change. One is the way that we access information and perceive the world around us. So this is the set of concerns around what is real, what is not, deepfake images, voice cloning, increasingly being used for fraud, for extortion, but also dramatically shaping our political discourse as we grapple with what truth looks like. Another way in which our information ecosystem is being transformed is through generative AI and AI summaries, and this can be as simple as the search summary that is now appearing when you go and search for information online. How reliable is that? Who is making decisions about what is being summarized in that space? And what does that mean for the way in which we perceive different voices, different sets of facts on different topics? A second area is where AI is being used already today to make very significant decisions about people's lives and access to economic opportunity. And this can be everything from AI making decisions about who is hired for a job, who's approved for a loan, your access to public benefits, whether you're accused of fraud or not. There are huge efficiency gains to be earned in this space, so I'm not criticizing the use of AI in these domains, but it tells us that with those use cases, boy, do we have to tread carefully to make sure that we are not replicating, deepening existing social inequality and worsening societal decline as a result. The third bucket that I think is worth spending time on is how AI transforms and gives extraordinary power to governments and to companies against us as individuals. And you can think about this through a couple different examples, although you'd be able to fill in even more. The use of face recognition technology right now, which means at any moment, walking down the street at any time, you can be identified. There is no freedom of movement right now. There's no technological freedom of movement. What does bound that is safeguards, laws, and norms about what is permissible when the government really can know every single person who was at a protest and then follow up with them after if they would want to. We've seen that happen in repressive regimes. We've seen it happen in American cities. When the government or a company can know every single thing that you're looking up online, how you're communicating with others, and also where our location information is often available and up for sale because of lax privacy practices. And AI now layers in extraordinary capabilities to weave those little breadcrumbs that we leave in our digital lives and tie them together into a much more comprehensive picture of you. That reimagining of our individuality, our privacy, our civil liberties gives extraordinary power to the people that can collect this information, again, whether it be private companies or the government. And again, we need safeguards. But right now, at least in the US, but also in some other places around the world, we really are falling behind in what the guardrails look like. We are not yet having the robust, democratic, participatory conversation around what the laws and norms should be. And instead, it really is in the hands of private company decision makers deciding what's an appropriate use case and what is not. And I think that right now we need far more people engaging with it through a more traditional governance process to make real progress.
Thanks, Alex. We're going to come back to several of those themes shortly. So if all of what you've heard so far is not enough of a case for regulation, I'm hoping, Klon, you can also speak about the global security angle on all of this.
Yeah, so maybe trying to braid together a couple of threads and then expand. I think what we're in the midst of is a renegotiation of the social contract. Not to put too big of a hand wave on that. But what I mean by that is I think there's very broad agreement that artificial intelligence and its kind of ancillary capabilities that it's going to enable are going to reshape societies, economies, and certainly battlefields. And that is, as has already been mentioned, overwhelmingly being developed as a technology in the private sector for commercial applications. And so that has led to two realizations. The government, and I mean the governments across the globe, not just the United States, are now recognizing that they are a national security stakeholder and no longer the national security stakeholder. And industries are, particularly the artificial intelligence labs and the companies built around them, are increasingly waking up to the realization that, hey, congratulations, you worked very hard to be masters of the universe and to be able to shape the world around you. Guess what? With that comes responsibilities. And no, there's no shirking that. You're going to be held accountable, and we're going to figure that way out. So if you want to put that reality as just something which societies and governments across the globe are all dealing with, then you have a spectrum in terms of how, say, the United States is trying to go about it, which I would align myself with all of the speed bumps and frustrations and slowness that have been articulated. That's absolutely the case. But the U.S. approach is one of, and we'll talk more about this so I won't go too deeply, but of kind of voluntary, trying to find some type of voluntary cooperation between government and industry to good ends. It's messy, it's hard, we're not there. On the opposite side of the spectrum is the Chinese Communist Party in China, who's simply chosen to co-opt their industry and use it as an extension of the state. We can talk more about that. The fundamental point, though, on all of this is that AI is going to be reshaping all of the things that I mentioned, and in ways, it's going to be great. But in many ways, it's going to be very disruptive and potentially terrible. And policymakers are hearing both stories constantly from the labs themselves. And so there's a general policy desire to figure out, okay, how do I realize as many of these benefits as possible because they could super enable our country and our people, human thriving and the like. At the same time, they could break some pretty important things. And so how do we mitigate risks while trying to realize those benefits? That's the tension. All the easy decisions have been made. The only thing left is hard. And so, yeah, happy to talk more about that.
Well, let me just stick with you for a second, Klon. Just go a little bit deeper on what are, as we're looking at the current state of AI regulation such as it is, help us with the key differences. And you talked a little bit about the U.S. position and China, but there are other growing influential players in the world on AI as well.
Yeah. So again, on that spectrum, you've got the U.S., you've got the Chinese Communist Party, and please note that I'm making distinctions between their government and their people. In the middle is essentially the EU, which is trying to have it both ways and failing miserably. But to everybody's credit, everybody is operating out of they're orienting off of a worldview, kind of some baseline assumptions about the nature of governance itself and how the government relates to people. And that's all being reflected in how they're going about their regulatory posture. So in the United States, as I said, the ideal that we're pursuing is one of voluntary cooperation based on shared interest and understandings. Ours is way messy. It's not fast, it's not agile. I do think it's more enduring. And I do think ultimately it leads to greater human thriving and certainly more human freedom. On the opposite side, you've got the CCP, which, as I said, is co-opting industry. Theirs can be very agile. And it remains to be seen, but it's entirely possible that it may be good enough to be a type of competitor to the US model. The model that I don't think has legs, that I don't think is sustainable, is the European Union model. And I'm rendering an analytic judgment, not necessarily a value judgment, but it orients itself off of a particular understanding of individual safety and rights, which is a very EU particular way of understanding things that's different than both of those other two. And it has created an economic bloc that is simply unable to support a technology industrial base. And so when the US and China talk about AI regulation, they have a radically different level of skin in the game than does the EU. Of the top 50, they've got top 50 tech companies, they've got 4. The US outranks them by factors of 10 at least on virtually every economic scale when it comes to the technological industrial base. And so that just means that they tend to approach these issues with a comfort using a broadsword rather than a scalpel, because they're not trying to maintain that industrial base the way the other 2 actors are.
Yeah. So, Vilas, I want to come to you next to talk about, as I mentioned, you're very involved with the United Nations perspective on where we go with AI. So what is the role of the UN here? How much influence does it have, and what goals are you trying to achieve?
Thank you, Vivian. And if you don't mind, maybe before we go there, 30 seconds.
Go for it.
I want to acknowledge that even in this conversation, I think we're beginning to see some of that. How do we map our constructs of what the world should look like to how should technology build it? And I think that's perfectly fair, right? National security concerns, thinking about values and principles and different governmental approaches. And yet it still leaves open this wide and big question that sits at the center of this, which is, if you had the capacity to sit down and re-envision from scratch what a world looks like when you have the economic cornucopia of what AI might promise, when you actually say that many of the assumptions that have limited and created this incredibly tense multipolar geography that we live in today, like actually some of those things release and you're actually able to redesign with an aspiration, what would that world look like? And I think in governance, one of the great challenges is that regulation, particularly in the United States, has been cast as a reaction to technological overreach or the creation of vulnerability. And what we have fundamentally lost is a sense that governance is actually an aspirational and hopeful process of thinking about how you build a world in which behaviors align to the kinds of activities, actions, incentives, and behaviors you want to see. I think it's important to hold that, right? So when you ask me about the United Nations, I can give you all of the very realistic and pragmatic observations I've had as a part of a process, and I can also tell you that I still hold a deep aspiration that we can live in a world where multilateralism means something. And you have to compare the pragmatism of today to the aspiration of tomorrow. Let me answer your question. The United Nations, the Secretary General, I think in quite a meaningful and visionary way, quite early in the process, realized that there was a need for some form of multinational engagement and called together a high-level advisory body which issued a report. And the report called for 3 things that have been moved into action. The first is a way for us to have international scientific level engagement, to actually bring the conversation about what AI is out of those private labs we've talked about and build a forum for experts to be able to engage in public visibility, to talk about what AI is, where it's going, and what it might be. To take the conversation about superintelligence, we can talk about superintelligence if you like, and move it from headlines and marketing slogans from the heads of the major tech companies to something that actually forces us to ask a different question. If superintelligence is truly as close as these people will have us believe, what do we do about it? How do we build policy structures and engagement around it? The second was to align around best practices on governance, to ask the question, and I do believe we don't live in a world around AI that's the US and China, or the US, China, and EU. I see amazing activity happening around AI in communities around the world. From India, which is taking a whole of nation approach, from the Middle East, I know that we have some folks here from Abu Dhabi that's been leading on the scientific side of it, to communities across the planet that are deploying these products at scale. What do we learn from those experiences that actually transform governance from how do we keep the tech companies from doing bad things to saying how do we make AI useful for people at scale? And the last is, I think, maybe the most important thing, which is to recognize the deep inequity of where AI sits today and find a solution to address it. There's a broadsword approach, Klon, I appreciate the metaphor, which is, well, what you need to do is just put a lot of money into the system. But I think there's a more nuanced way of thinking about the equity of access to AI, to think about how we build compute infrastructure that isn't just private sector and is sold to the highest bidder, but is a sovereign process where you actually say, we'll build compute at scale and make it available to people who want to solve problems around the world. Where we think about data not merely as a matter of aggregating the data that defines a commercial life, but gives real dignity for people. I'll give you the very quick example. I've told this story a few times, but a West African government that was very happy to show me their incredibly adept AI systems that use geospatial intelligence and a bunch of data to tell you where the most extractable natural resources are, where the cobalt, the gold, the silver, the whatever is. And in that meeting, I saw all of it, and I said, this is great. You have collected data over 30 years from mining companies and others that have come in and invested in building these data sets. Can you also show me on the same map where the surface level potable safe drinking water is? And they looked at me like I was crazy. That data has never been collected because there was never a commercial incentive to do it. And yet that data is exactly as meaningful in people's lives as how much it costs to get the gold out and ship it overseas. So compute, data, and finally talent infrastructure. How do we build a global fund and a mechanism that transforms our capacity to train individuals to understand AI literacy at scale? To build not just the Harvards and the Stanfords and the great universities, but to actually make accessible to people the tools that let them architect their own digital future. This is what's coming out of these multilateral processes, right? Are not maybe necessarily fully baked institutions, but the underlying convictions about what justice and dignity requires in multilateral governance of AI.
So, Vilas, I'm sold on that vision. I'm like, sign me up, I'm all there. I wonder, though, in the face of, you know, China and the US and the pressure to compete, to continue to compete, how we make that happen. And I'd love you, well, let me turn to Alex to say a couple of words about where do you see this going? And as a corollary to that, and I'll come back, I know you want to respond to that, but as a corollary to that, Alex, you know, we hear from a lot of the AI labs all the time going, please regulate us, please regulate us. So help us understand what that's really about.
Yeah, so it's an interesting dynamic, right? And one of the main political trends that you will hear right now is to compete with China, we need foot on the gas, full acceleration, that is the path forward. And I think that that's a pretty reductionist way to view the world, because we need to compete not only to have the most highly capable models, but models that people will actually use and integrate into their business operations, into their daily lives. And for us to be able to do that, you need to build on trust. And so one of the arguments that we make is that it's a false dichotomy to say that there's regulation over here and innovation over here. But much as Vilas was saying, those two things have to go hand in hand, and that responsible rules of the road do help people drive faster. Right? And the analogy here is looking at, well, what are the basic elements of governance that people who want to integrate AI into their systems so that we have better functioning government systems, a faster moving economy, what do they need to be able to actually trust and use these systems in a meaningful way? And there is emerging consensus around this. We're just lacking the political will at the federal level in the US to make progress on it. But we're seeing it in US states, in the EU, and I have a different take on the EU and their approach to regulation than you do, which is not surprising. We fight about this in DC as well.
We don't fight.
We don't fight, we discuss.
Yeah.
In the Aspen but there are building blocks around this, right? And the same thing happens. I spend a lot of my life going around talking to practitioners. So these aren't the people that go to the big political rallies and the speeches, but they're the ones who are working for the banks, working for the hospitals, working for the companies that are trying to integrate AI systems. And you know what they want? They want to make sure that a system has cybersecurity built into it, was built with privacy considerations, is explainable, is legible so they know how the system is working so that they can interrogate it, has fairness built in so that it is going to work for all of their users. And so there's this narrative that we're seeing in some political conversations right now that talking about that is somehow woke or decelerationist. And it really isn't. It's the pathway for enablement. And so I think the more that we can get clear-eyed about that and build on those building blocks, so instead of it just being practitioners to practitioners right now saying, hey, what are you doing to make sure that this is truly private? We actually have better safeguards that benefit all of us instead of the few companies that are willing to go out and lead in that space.
Go ahead.
Doesn't it somehow feel, when you see the headlines about the newest, biggest model, the innovation, the competitiveness, sometimes feels like you're hanging out with a group of adolescent boys who are just like, how do we make a bigger explosion? How do we make the thing go faster? Like, it's this very juvenile approach to thinking about the power of a system like AI. Make it bigger, make it faster, put more money into it, put more data into it. We need $500 billion to build a new supercompute facility. And somehow we never just take the step back, as Alex says, to ask the question, the things that we have built that already should create a sense of wonder and awe, how do we make it relevant for the people who live in the world today? How do we invest in the translational architecture of AI? How do we make sure that as we make these design decisions, we ask those questions that Alex spoke to so eloquently around fairness and explainability and privacy? Doesn't it feel like that's just a very different conversation than the one that's happening in the headlines? And if so, why don't we make a different decision?
Klon, I want to turn to you. Is this vision, which again, I'm fully on board with, how practical is it and how likely is it? And from your point of view, is it desirable?
There's parts of it that I find very attractive. I'm very happy that Vilas and Alex and others are pursuing the creation of most of the world they describe. That's not my gig. and I can't.
Why you're here.
Well, and I can't wait for that paradise to emerge before I get my job done. I have questions, so things like we can design a new kind of paradigm of governance. Who's the we? Who specifically? Because there's going to be a lot of variance between the different we's out there who want to do that. And I'm accounting for that. That is not to say that we should be resigned to kind of a pessimistic, reductionist worldview on all this. Not at all. In fact, my hope is that if we can manage ourselves well over the next decade, I think what's on offer is perhaps an unparalleled productivity, economic thriving, and ultimately human thriving that won't remain just within the borders of the United States, but I think the United States, as it always has, will export that globally, perhaps in a way that we've never been able to do before. So I'm actually quite optimistic if I can get through this decade. That's what I'm concerned about. That's the near-term challenge.
That's a big if.
Well, it is. I'm sorry. As I said, no easy choices left. This is only hard stuff now.
Can I chime in on who's the we?
Yep.
Because it's a really good question, and I do think it's gonna be a hybrid. It's going to be a hybrid answer, kind of what you were alluding to in your first response, which is some of this is right and appropriate for democratically elected governments to be coming up with regimes, and we're seeing progress in that. So in the US, not at the federal level, there's been some good discussions there. At the state level, Colorado, for example, has passed an AI Act. The EU has their AI Act. South Korea has a framework. And one of the common elements of these is that they are working really hard to be risk-based, right? So they acknowledge that face recognition on people is different than face recognition on turtles, which is a thing, and that we only need to regulate one of them when it has a high risk for how it is going to impact people's rights and liberties. They acknowledge that privacy considerations built in certain uses are going to be really important. They push for documentation and transparency so that people can exercise more market choice. And what we're seeing in some of these regulatory frameworks is realizing that basic legislation helps enable market freedom and market choice by giving people more visibility into what these systems are, how they're working, how they're designed, so we can actually make choices about whether we want to use them or not, whether we want to participate in that system or not. So regulation is one important piece of it. But to your point, it's not going to solve everything, because there are some things where it's just too hard to regulate or there's too much difference. Exactly how a chatbot should answer a question about whether the world is flat, personally, I don't think there should be a law on that. A lot of people disagree on what the exact way to handle that trust and safety question is. Much as on social media, we will often disagree around what content should appear on a social media site and what shouldn't. So to my mind, there's room for companies to be acting, hopefully to compete on going to a particular audience. Some of them want a safer experience that's more curated. Others want more of a Wild West experience, and we can have those norms emerge. So it'll be a complement of those two things, legislation and company leadership speaking to and hopefully competing for their users. But right now, we're not having a thoughtful dialogue about either of those pieces.
I want to just come back to Klon for a minute, and then I'm going to come to you, Vilas, because I know, well, first of all, you said, I want to know how we get through the next 10 years, because you were like, you have us.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You had us. No, it's okay. But also you wanted to make
if I'm
extra
glad I had a
points,
solution,
and then I want to go
I'm
to
sorry,
Vilas.
that's not what I have.
Oh, come on.
No, look, I think it's going to be messy.
Yeah.
I mean, because we're balancing a lot of values and their intention sometimes. Let me give a great example. So let's take facial recognition. Okay, it is easy to get creeped out by facial recognition right away, all the way. None of us want to be tracked by our face all the time. I got it. I'm right there with you. However, let me give you a use case. Maybe you'll feel a little bit different about how this thing gets deployed. Let's say you're the headmaster of a school, and there's a service that you can purchase that, using facial and image recognition, can give you early indications and warning that a registered child sex offender or an individual with a weapon is entering into your campus. And that will buy you an extra 3 minutes to lock all the doors and get all the kids moved. That's not an easy answer. I don't mean to imply that's an easy answer, but I'm saying, like, look, not every use of this technology is as god-awful as you think it might be. There's actually some real societally beneficial utilizations as well. And that's one of the reasons in the United States that regulatory action is being slowed, is because when you start doing it, when you actually have to start writing legislation, not kind of big hand waves about the goodness we can all do, I agree, but when you actually have to write legislation about whose freedoms, fundamentally that's what we're talking about, whose freedoms are you going to constrain and how and for what reason? That's why we don't have particularly good legislation yet, right? Because in one sense I could say, yes, the United States is not acting in a regulatory manner as quickly as many people on the spectrum. Some of us would say, well, for the moment, that's a policy decision, not a policy failure. Because if politicians thought that they actually had the political will from their constituents to enact these things, I assure you they would do it. But what's actually happening, I think, currently, is an expression of the will of the people. Now, we can say that the people are ignorant and they don't know what they're doing. That certainly wouldn't be the first time. But nevertheless, from a political governance standpoint, I think our government is largely representing what the people are willing to countenance for the moment. Maybe that evolves. So my only point there is just, I try not to be, don't worry about it, you're good.
It's a good audience reaction.
I just let all the air out, didn't I? Sorry. So again, I want to be very clear. I don't know that materially we have a lot of disagreement. I suspect we have some, but not a lot. I'm just in the pragmatic, that implies you're not. My point, well, and I don't mean to imply that, just to be very clear, I do not mean to imply that at all. I'm just trying to balance things that I see in tension here. And I do come from a worldview of very, like, look, I got real issues at stake here that I got to solve for. And that's why I'm a Neanderthal.
Hardly. Vilas.
Let's see.
I know you want to respond to that.
No, I do, and it's because, Klon, I respect you so much that I think that we disagree on this, not in intuitions, but in consequences. So let me say what I mean by that. I think the first thing here, and I represent an institution that is the world's largest actual investor in AI for public purpose, right? Over $500 million that's been conveyed. So there is a pragmatism that underlies the lofty ideals that we've talked about on this panel because we've seen it through experience. To use that as grounding, let me say two things. One is, it is so easy for us to get caught up in the things that are so emotionally resonant in the moment. Our sense of safety, our sense of security, our violations of privacy. And to believe that the regulation we need is the things that protect those things that make us feel the most uncomfortable in the short term. But let me make you feel uncomfortable in the long term. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is that our entire economic system is built on a function of supply and demand. And I gave a lecture recently at the OECD to a bunch of economists where I demonstrated that if AI realizes some of its economic promise, we might live in a world where the supply curve essentially collapses. That automation and mechanization means that from a drone that's going out and digging into a hillside to extract, or bringing it to a factory, putting it on a drone ship, bringing it to the United States, putting it on a last mile delivery system, you might have an iPhone in your hand that no human being has ever touched. And I asked a group of economists, if this contention that the supply and demand collapses, where do we find the invisible hand of the market and what happens to the optimal frontier? You don't have to be an economist to know that these core tenets have essentially built the entire modern world we live in. And I was met with a set of people that just kind of stared at me and waited until I was off stage. Why do I bring this into this conversation? Because I think there is an immediate and necessary balance that's needed. Between all of the things that I think Alex and Klon have spoken to, the ways that we need to drive short-term policy regulations, to think about vulnerabilities, to think about harms, to think about competitiveness and American innovation. And yet we're sitting at Aspen Ideas, and so I have to ask the secondary question, which is, if on a 10, 15, or 20-year basis, we see such fundamental transformations of the underlying assumptions that guide our economic, social, international relations dynamics, where are we beginning to put forward the ideas that would shape what that new world looks like? Klon, you asked, I think, probably the most critical question of all, which is who is the we?
Yeah.
I think in times of human history when we've seen that kind of transformation, we have almost uniformly seen that we ignore the impending hallmarks and harbingers of this kind of transformation. We sit through a massive transformation that massively increases inequality, that often leads to war, to all kinds of negative social impacts. And then when we're through that, we come back and say, hey, wait, what could we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? I feel like we're sitting in that moment now, and yet we're repeating every mistake of the past. So why can't we do something different? And the we there is a combination. It's a combination of technologists that understand what the trajectory of AI might look like. It's the policymakers who hold a political mandate to try to figure that out as well. It's economists and humanists and philosophers and scholars who can come and help us learn from the lessons of history. And it's a very broad-based attempt, and we have spent tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to do this, to build a basic level of AI literacy so that, Klon, your argument no longer holds, that people are not uninformed, that they are informed, that they understand, and they recognize the impacts this will have not just on the lives of 3 generations from now, but on their kids and on their own lives. That's the we. That's why we're here. And I don't want it to be cast as that's some sort of lofty ideal that sits away from the pragmatism of how we do global arms control. We can't have those be 2 separate conversations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can tell just this conversation alone shows you how difficult these issues are. And these are 3 deeply informed, deeply thoughtful people who want the best for the world. Now, imagine a world that includes people of less good faith, which is why this is so difficult. We're going to come to your questions in just a minute. But I'm going to ask you a question that all of you will hate, but moderator's prerogative. And by the way, if you didn't realize already, I will tell you this whole panel has been a bait and switch, because you thought you were going to come in here and hear the solutions, and as you can hear, there maybe are not. That said, I'm going to ask each of you briefly to just say, what is one practical thing that institutions can do to try to move us towards a better place? I know that sounds very Pollyanna and unpractical, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So, who would like to jump in?
Vilas, go ahead.
Right. Let's be very pragmatic about it. I think the first thing, and I've already spoken to this, is to build a broad-based cultural awareness of the magnitude of the transformation that's coming. And we don't do that by big headlines from a few tech bros telling us how superintelligence will change everything and threaten humanity. We do it through the kind of work, the daily work of building cultural and community literacy around these topics. From making sure that in our educational systems in our schools, we're actually investing in making sure that there's an AI story that's part of the curriculum, that's embedded in how we teach, all the way through to how we make sure there's a cultural conversation about AI. We very recently partnered with Aspen Digital to do an event called Shared Futures. We hosted it in Washington, D.C. We brought in poets and painters and concert pianists and architects and artists to say, this is how AI is already transforming our practice of creativity. Think about if we could do a conversation like that across every sector. To have people who are actually the owners of the outcomes come back and think about AI as the enabler of their wishes and dreams, but also of the consequences that'll happen if we deploy these tools without thinking about safeguards and guardrails. I think that's very pragmatic, and we could do it in the next 5 to 10 years.
Great.
I'll chime into that. I think what we've been talking about actually isn't lofty. Like this is my day job. I view it as very applied, because we don't have time to be lofty and be talking about the world we want to see in 25 years even. The types of elements we're talking about here, how to make sure this technology is in service of humanity, the manner in which it is built. Is it built in a way that protects people's privacy, that is built on fairness, that has security as part of it, where humans understand how the tool is working so they can make an informed decision about when to rely on it and when not to rely on it? All of those are very common sense building blocks. We can talk about it in regulation. We can also talk about it to the tech companies as they build these tools. And we can shape the market who is buying these tools. So for the regular Main Street businesses who are thinking about these, the folks that do move markets, that shape market behavior, universities, NGOs, the AI for Good movement, they can all be leading by example right now in the choices they're making about what systems they use, when they use them, and how they inform the people that are affected by it. So that is very tangible, it is practical, it is what we can do now, even as the legislation lags behind. We all can be modeling what it is to have this technology actually be in service of people, and start that right now.
Takes home, Klon.
Okay, so very practical and playing to type. I think the U.S. government could have an ever-refreshed set of model evaluations and standards that they could provide to industry that would be up-to-date and regularly testing for novel national security threats. So if you expect industry to be responsible National Security Act participants, then you should give them a standard like, hey, look, before you deploy a model, we'd like you to kind of run it through the paces and be looking for these types of things. Ideally, that would be reinforced by industry as it learns and becomes more sophisticated in their own model testing. I would like that to be voluntary because I have skepticism about the government's capacity to kind of keep up with the pace. Not their intentions, not the goodness of the people doing it, but just like the scale and speed of this is dwarfing everything. I also like the idea of voluntary model review, maybe past a certain standard, but AI labs making cutting-edge models available for review by a trusted entity for novel national security threats prior to deployment. So if you are, choose your lab, and you think, hey, you know what, I think we just transitioned to AI kind of level 3, and we think that that's going to open up pathways in a whole host of, hey, we've done the testing, here's our homework, take a look at it,
Voluntary, though, right?
It's the closest I get. Well, so here's the reason I say that actually is because right now you can't do that with open source. So it can be reviewed, but you can't compel it, right? You can just go grab it, but then it's peculiar. And honestly, the capability gap between open source and proprietary models is shrinking very rapidly. And so even if you do, if you're a lab, you can say, listen, USG, I'm very happy to give you a peek under the hood before I deploy this, but you can't do this in less than 6 months. And Llama 4 is already out there in the wild, and the longer I'm waiting on you to give me the green light, I'm just falling further and further behind, which actually has material financial impact, which before we kind of write them off as being a bunch of greedy people who only care about money, remember, it's the resources that enable them to continue to advance the science and do, we talk about these companies, but we pretend like they don't do billions and billions of dollars every year in philanthropic activity, including enabling.
We're all raising eyebrows.
Well, including enabling AI research at the university level in underserved communities, building whole types of training capabilities for underrepresented communities. Like a lot of that energy, not exclusively, but a lot of that energy comes from the labs themselves. And so I'm okay, and look, Google me, you will see that I have no problem backhanding some of these companies. But like credit where credit is due, right? I mean, they're the ones, frankly, keeping us in the game. It's not the US government. And so,
Right, well, we could go down a long rabbit hole on this, but I promised we'd go to questions. So, oh my gosh. I saw your hand go up first, so let's go over here. And please say your name and your affiliation if you're comfortable doing so.
Hi, I'm Alicia. I can speak loudly.
Yeah.
We can repeat.
I'm Alicia. I represent the Colorado River Valley Economic Development Partnership. You can get me an AI shorter name, that'd be great. We are a region about an hour and a half from here. Majority of people who you see working in this area live in my area, and they'll commute 3 to 4 hours a day on a good day. So that's the first thing. One thing I think you missed in the we is our grassroots people in our communities, right? Underserved communities. You know what that means for us? We had BEAD funding for our county that only could go to underserved internet communities. We don't even have ISPs that will come to our region to give us competitive offerings to give people lower cost internet, let alone information on what AI is. And we're not considered underserved because unincorporated Garfield County is, and that's people who choose to live out in areas that don't have utilities. So I guess my question is, how can an organization such as mine, which we are not funded, we are fighting in like every nonprofit, to even just get people on board within our community to know that we're legitimate and trying to bring these things to them, how do we get in on the game? Because that's what is missing, is we can't solve the world's problems. You can do that. I'm happy for you to be in that role. My role is to get my community access to your point, where's the groundwater instead of the minerals?
that's good.
Bless you
It's
for
not.
that
It's not
comment.
economically viable.
Yeah.
So how do we have a seat at the table?
It's such a critical point, right? We talk about America first and America leading the world, and yet basic funding for connectivity for all parts of our country still has not been solved. And so we have to be, and I think the answer is we have to do both, right? So we have to be investing in that innovation to continue market leadership, but we also really have to work on the fundamentals. And so I'm glad that you named it. I do think that there were really important statutory reforms and massive investment that went in under the last administration that we all know are significantly in jeopardy right now. And it is so short-sighted to be cutting off that basic fundamental access just in the pursuit of a global agenda that isn't actually buttressed if our communities aren't online.
Great, thank you. Question right here.
So
Thanks,
just
Alan.
a practical question. As a business leader trying to integrate AI applications across our business, as we deal with different vendors, we ask about cybersecurity, protecting our customers' data, protecting our proprietary data. How do we get any confidence in the answers we get from those vendors? And just sort of what recourse do we have? What transparency is there to validate the answers that we get?
I'm tempted to call on Sasha O'Connell, who leads the Aspen cybersecurity programs, but we'll leave it up here. We can talk
I'll answer
afterwards.
I love that question, and I think it really identifies why regulation can be complementary to adoption, because the type of having more confidence in what people are saying and having a more uniform language for even what you should be asking for. It sounds like you're informed customers that are asking many of the most important questions. Many businesses are not, and so they are, and state and local governments adopting AI tools are in the same boat. They're being, the vendors are flooding the zone with a sales pitch. How do you actually untangle what is good? There are some efforts now in the private sector and helped by NIST, which is a agency within the Department of Commerce developing standards for risk management to try and get more specificity around what good documentation for AI adopters of AI looks like. What's the paperwork you should be asking for? And if you know what to ask for and you're getting it in a disclosure, then you have a contractual remedy if somebody lied to you, right? So at least there's something that the market there can do. But to my mind, it's really not sufficient because people, again, don't know what to ask for. And a lot of times we have to think not only about B2B, but business to consumers. And consumers really don't know what to ask for. And it's really hard for us to sue if something goes wrong.
Great, thank you. How about just right here in the back?
Hi, I'm Candace. I'm with explore.org. Going back to IDing turtles, we have a fairly sought-after data set, and a lot of these companies seem to have a ask forgiveness, not permission mindset when it comes to training their models. Is there any, anything on the horizon that gives companies like us recourse to protect our own data against these companies?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Do you want to answer it on New York Times?
No,
You're an expert on this topic.
no, that's okay. I want to leave it to the panel.
Well, what I'll say is, a lot of these questions are actually very aligned. We are trying to fit last year's view of thinking about the world onto this year's opportunities. The short answer is absolutely we should have a better mechanism for the ownership of data, for the economic rights that are inherent in it, particularly for communities that create it. We should have new forms of consumer protection to actually consider this question of what happens when a business uses an AI system that hasn't been properly validated. And that also fits within this regulatory environment that we have to build and develop.
Yeah.
A lot of that is being decided in the courts right now, so
It is.
copyright cases, and also trying to figure out what are the signals you could put on your website to say that you don't want to be scraped. So right now there's something called robots.txt, which says that you don't want to be scraped for indexing in search engines. But that's not the same function. That's not fit for purpose for saying I don't want to be scraped for an AI tool. So that's one of the standards groups. It's like an industry conversation right now. So there are interesting again, this we is pretty diverse of where the different conversations can happen. So I think a lot to come in that space. Many people are in the same position you are.
Watch the UK. There's interesting things going on there. Oh gosh, we have more questions than we have time for. Why don't we take let's ask two questions in a row, and then we're right over here, and then we'll answer those, and then unfortunately we need to wrap. I'm sorry.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dan Bateko. I'm a PhD student at Cornell studying AI and law.
Go Big Red.
Go, there we go. Yeah. I've heard like 3 eras of AI here. There's the machine learning, statistical machine learning in facial recognition that we've been grappling with for 20, 30 years. There's the fairly new on the scene language modeling that have chatbots and trust and safety issues. What I've only heard kind of teased is like the super intelligence piece of the puzzle, or the idea that these language
short answer to
models
kind of this
can start, going out and doing human-like things at scale. And so my question is, in your spaces, in your discussions, and your, with your colleagues, how are you thinking about these questions? Because I know in academia, we sure as heck are. We're thinking a lot about it, building out super intelligence.
Sorry, I don't think we can take, thank you for that. I don't think we can take the second question. I apologize. They're going to start going. Who would like to take that?
In the 18 seconds I have, I talk a lot about the 5 stages of grief of AI. I'll talk about it tomorrow at a panel that I'm doing if you want to come by. But the very short answer is there has to be a rational, scientifically grounded approach to how we think about AGI, superintelligence. There has to separately be a very smart way that we think about agency and autonomy and the ways that we let these systems have control in the world. And those two things have to happen in different forums, but they have to converge. And we're not doing any of that. Right now, we're just following headlines.
Yeah. All right, sorry, we were out of time, but I think we're going to hang around a little bit. So Klon, Alex, Vilas, thank you so much. Thank you for your great questions.